we do change a lot as we get older. And we one of the most wonderful developmental stories is that we do become more emotionally stable with age. And again, a lot. We change a full standard deviation from when we're 20 to when we're 60 when it comes to emotional stability, maybe even more. And and you see that older people tend to be calmer. They tend to be less anxious. You look back when you're my age and you think, "Gosh, I wish I would have been like this when I was 20." Because you know how scared you were at that point and how insecure, and that's neuroticism, and it affects your world in a lot of different ways that aren't really wonderful.
Brent, thank you so much for doing this. I mentioned this before I recorded. I've been looking forward to doing a show exclusively on the Big Five for quite some time now, so I'm happy to be doing this. Welcome. It's great to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
I wanted to start with kind of the basics here, and I thought maybe the best question to start the conversation might be just positing the question to you of what do we mean by personality when we talk about personality, and what specifically does the Big Five personality traits really mean to you?
So we're only supposed to talk for about 45 minutes, right? You just asked me to summarize my 15-week course, which I don't get through most of the material in 5 minutes or less. So there are a couple of different levels when it comes to the definition of personality. And I think you need to kind of give each its respect, so to speak. From my vantage point as a personality psychologist, I see personality psychology as subsuming the entire spectrum of ways in which each of us differs from each other. And so in that respect, it's a much broader idea than what most lay people think of, for example, or even many of my colleagues in psychology. So when I think of it, I think of individual differences in something like the Big Five, which we can cover in a sec. Those are, we call them personality traits, which is, especially if you've had the folks from evolutionary psychology or evolution on, it's a bit of a confusing term to use, at least in a relationship to the way they use the term trait. They use it to reflect a species-specific feature. We use it to reflect individual differences in kind of basic patterns that are not cognitive ability, for example. And some lay people will carve off, and some psychologists will carve off personality and say it's the Big Five. I want to include things like, your cognitive abilities, your other skills, physical or social and interpersonal, your Big Five, your motives, your interests, the things you love to do, which are not the same thing as your Big Five. And of course, you have your story, your individual experience, and the thing that makes you who you are. So we have these personality traits and our motives and interests and abilities, but they're manifest in our, typical, our let's say, our historical period. And we have our own particular way of manifesting those qualities within our time and our space. And those experiences in our lives actually have an effect on those functions, like whether we retain our cognitive functioning over a long period of time, whether we lose it, whether we get more conscientious or not, and things of that sort happen because of the life stories that we live. So I like to think of it as a big thing, and it has at least these 4 categories of information. I want to know somebody. I want to know what they're good at. I want to know what they tend to do on a regular basis. I want to know what they want to do, and I want to know their story. And it's usually in reverse. I usually like to know their story before these other things. And those are the big buckets of information that I'm going to seek out if I'm going to really do a good job of trying to understand who you are. The Big Five are one particular subset of that, and they're the regularities that we see in the characteristic ways that people think, feel, and behave, which is a horrible definition. It's the standard definition that we use, has no counterfactual, so it's really not very useful. But it's a nice sing-songy definition that we give people. The most important aspects of that, at least from a scientific perspective, are the emphasis on, continuity, and I like to invoke automaticity. So these are the things that you do regularly without thinking about it. You can think about it. We ask you to think about it whenever we give you one of our standard personality inventories, our non-standard ones. The MBTI comes to mind. And, for better or worse, that's our usual way of getting at these things. But what we're trying to get at is the way you do things on a regular basis. And, that could be something you're consciously aware of or not. So we do like to ask you, but we also might like to ask your friends, your loved ones, to weigh in and say, this is the way Daniel really is. Don't listen to him. He's a really nice guy. He said he's not, but it's not true. So that's the type of stuff that we like to do to get at those. And the big five come in five big categories. There's extroversion, how you engage socially with the world. You want to lead or do you want to follow? The agreeableness, which is, do you want to be a good team member or do you want to be your own lone wolf and out there carving your own way through life? Conscientiousness, which is better summarized as grit, because that's only one syllable and it's a lot easier to understand. So how hardworking are you going to be? Are you going to be nose to the grindstone type? Are you going to be, as I like to describe my daughters, efficient in their approach to the amount they like to work? Then there's emotional stability, which is the way you handle stress. Do you have a very bright radar screen and you notice lots of things that are cause of concern, or do you have a dark radar screen and nothing seems to affect you? That would be somebody that we would think of as being emotionally stable. And then the last category is openness, which is the broadest and the least coherent area. That includes things like creativity, open different ideas, curiosity, intellectually, let's say intellectually inclined, as opposed to being more concrete and maybe incurious would be the way I describe people who would be on the low end. And those big five are they're a working taxonomy. They're not, some people like to think of them as pillars of human nature. They're regularities. We see them a lot. And they should not be ignored, but they're one way of understanding the way personality traits can be organized, and it's been incredibly useful for us as a scientific field to adopt the Big Five as a framework. But it's a framework, and it's a little bit loose, and there are other qualities that are out there that might be included. Honesty is one that we sometimes consider, and then there's also levels of analysis that we might want to think about, because there's some brilliant work by people like Gerard Saussure that show across cultures that 2 work better than 5. If you want to do something better, maybe you go down to 14. You've got a lot of different choices about where to go. But as a field, we've to varying degrees said 5 is good for now. Let's stick with those.
I have to imagine you hear this a lot in students and in people who learn about what you do, that it's common in our culture that people talk about the Myers-Briggs tests or other forms of categorizing human personality. I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak to the veracity of the Big Five versus some of the more common personality assessments that people talk about in America and around the world. What distinguishes the Big Five in your mind as a higher standard, if that is your perspective, over some of the other more common personality assessments that I think a lot of people listening to this might be aware of?
I think the way I would recommend thinking about the Big Five is kind of the same way we do. It's your validated barometer. And there's a feature of the Big Five that's really important to keep in mind that I already mentioned in some respects. It shows up everywhere, right? Whenever we measure things, it kind of reveals itself. There's a beautiful paper by Luke Smiley's lab out of Australia that they just published recently, is showing, look, you take lots of different measures, and you kind of look at it from the Big Five perspective, and they all seem to belong. I like to argue that the categories of the Big Five are like families. They get along, but they might fight. No, there's different facets and there's different levels, but it's a really good system for understanding what's going on. So if anybody comes to you with an assessment system that is focused on something like this, and there's lots of tests out there, the MBTI, the color test, lots of different tests, especially in industry. And they might argue a lot about how they're not personality, or they're not personality traits, or they're not the Big Five. Well, you know what? You can't have both. So if the Big Five is something that tends to show up and organize most everything out there, if you take an assessment system that has to do with kind of this kind of functioning, not your cognitive functioning and your power test, so to speak, but like what you typically do, you're probably going to run into the Big Five. And the MBTI is a beautiful example. It measures 4 of the Big Five. Not as well as I want to when it comes to my scientific endeavors, but it's not, a lot of people like to try to establish their intellectual chops by criticizing the big five as anti-science and invalid and stuff. It's not invalid. Nothing is invalid. What it does is it approximates something of the big five to a lesser or greater degree, right? And what the MBTI did, which was brilliant from a marketing perspective, was it eliminated all the negative qualities. So it got rid of neuroticism and emotional stability altogether. And then it took out the negative aspects of, extroversion and conscientiousness and agreeableness and openness. And then you're left with a really friendly, wonderful, validating thing that no matter who you are, you're positive, right? So from a marketing angle, it is why they make so much money, and it's why everybody loves it and why everybody takes it. And it's probably a little bit why we tend to grumble about it. But it's a pretty mediocre way of getting it for the big five. And so is it invalid? No. Is there a scoring approach valid? No. We should not categorize people. There's never been any validity for that. It's a gross oversimplification of the way humans work. We are built in continua. We're not built in categories. And so, but is it wrong? Completely, not completely either. And it appeals to another aspect of human nature. Humans want to be validated, so the MBTI is good for that. It also is the fact that we like to think in categories. So we like it, we like to do things in a more expedient fashion, more efficient. And so by categorizing the information that we glean through the MBTI, makes it a lot easier for people to understand and to communicate. And again, so it's brilliant from a marketing standpoint. You get rid of the negative aspects of human functioning, and then you make it really simple, and you've created the most popular test in the world. But it is, in no uncertain terms, still covering some of the domains of the big five. And that's true for the other types of tests that are out there.
I want to quote, we talked about this a little bit before we started recording, that Rob Henderson put us in touch with each other. And I think we both have admiration and love for his work. I'm going to quote something from him that he wrote on the Big Five, and I want to get your thoughts on it. This is from an article that he recently published, which he's referencing some of the work of Jordan Peterson, but I think these are his words, where he says, by far the greatest range of diversity among people is personality, rather than the usual categories society tends to concentrate on. I thought that was such a pithy and interesting point, that of all the differences that we can categorize between human beings around the world, that in his mind, as I understand that line, it's personality that is the biggest indicator of a different type of person. And I wanted to put it to you to ask you how you think about this. He also writes later in this article about how people of significantly different personalities are really filtering and seeing the world differently than other people who are, for example, on opposite ends of the extroversion scale. I'm just curious for you how you think people can try to make sense of the greatness and range in human personality, to maybe make sense of people that they come across that are drastically different than they are.
That's a great question. It's a nice quote. I don't know if I agree with it empirically, because I think it's one of those empirical questions that are almost impossible to answer. And what comes to mind are a couple of things. One, there's not very much interesting covariance between what we think of as personality and what we think of as the large categories that we use to structure society. Personality is unrelated to cognitive ability. Personality is relatively unrelated to race and ethnicity. Personality, and I'm going to piss off some of your listeners, is far less related to gender than some people would like to argue. There are a bunch of evolutionary folks who, let's say, spun the wheel in their favor when they analyzed the data. If you look at the differences between men and women, we're the same on extroversion. We're the same on most facets of agreeableness, except for neuroticism. Women are slightly better on conscientiousness. Neuroticism, we differ on a D-score of 0.4, and we don't differ on openness. If you add up all the differences and take the potential maximum amount of difference, you can push it to something that looks big. But that's not the way it usually works. In any given area within personality, we don't differ that much from each other. So in some respects, he's right from that angle, where we use all these categories to structure our societies and our different cultures, usually around demographics. And the mistake I think we often make is we think of those demographic aspects as giving us personality information. In that respect, Rob is totally correct. It's not. If somebody is a certain race or ethnicity, it doesn't provide you almost any information about their personality. You need to go to that. Whether the variance is more or less really depends in some respects. Sorry about the dogs. On the question you're answering and asking, right? And there, that's why I'm not necessarily willing to say, sure, yeah, Rob's right on that one, because in certain categories, being a male or female makes a huge difference in what happens to you in your life, or how a society is structured. Far more important than your personality will have in terms of your outcomes in your work or your love, for example. And so I'm reticent to say, yeah, Rob's right. The variability when it comes to human functioning is far greater on personality than it is these other things, because it really depends on the question you're trying to address. Mm-hmm. And there, I'm not willing to say I know enough about the relative magnitude of the effects of race, ethnicity, gender, age, and other factors when it comes to these things, to be able to say with a sound conclusion that, yeah, the variability there is greater or lesser. I think what we mostly see is there's lots of differences between people. They all have relatively small effects for most things that we care about, in certain categories that count a lot.
Yeah.
And that's where it matters.
And I think to clarify there, it may have been that Rob was essentially paraphrasing Jordan's perspective. And I don't know if he was giving commentary specifically as to whether he fully agreed with that statement or not, but he can obviously speak to that to give his perspective on it. But I wanted to hone in on something that you did mention there, which is that, if I heard you correctly, the biggest known difference in the big five between the genders is in trait neuroticism. And I'd love to, I think you said that the difference was something like 0.4. And I wanted to allow you to give that some space and explain exactly what that would mean to a layperson who's not particularly steeped in the statistical analysis there.
Yeah. Well, I always like to qualify it with some research that was done a long time ago by Dan Ozer, where he asked people to identify people who were different from each other, and ask the question, how different do people have to be on our scales for someone to be able to see it reliably? We do all our science and we publish these things that are statistically significant, and sometimes they're hugely practically significant, especially if you talk to the economists, for example, because you change social policy across millions of people, it has a notable effect. A lot of those effects aren't visible to the naked eye. And Dan Ozer's research showed that if you want to really see a difference between an extrovert and introvert, on our scale, they have to be about a standard deviation different from each other, which when it comes to like our personality inventories, that's a whole scale point. On a 5-point rating scale, that's a 3 versus a 4. When it comes to men and women, we differ at about half or a little less than half on a scale point. And so the difference is notable from the perspective that it can be seen by scientists with our data, but it's probably not that visible, at least on individuals, on an individual basis, to the naked eye. And the biggest ones are something like neuroticism. You might notice it across an aggregate of people, and that's where you notice it most. But with individual people, it's really hard to see.
I'm curious if you are persuaded by some of the evolutionary psychology arguments there, because my understanding, and you can correct me if you think this is wrong or the data suggests otherwise, but that the two of the most noteworthy differences in the big five between men and women are neuroticism, and I think it's trait agreeableness, and that the idea that I had heard was that it's possible that the reason why that difference exists from the perspective of nature is that if women are going to have kids and do that successfully, it actually is a benefit to have a more neurotic brain, a more agreeable temperament, in order to be able to perform that role properly or successfully. I don't know what your take is on that, but it was something I wanted to get your views on.
I'll give you a set of questions to ask them. So, and these are just questions that I want to know the answer to before I render judgment on their thoughts. I think their thoughts are reasonable given what they have hooked up from evolutionary psychology. But so two sets of questions in my mind are critical for whether we think this is the case. First is the genetics argument. If there is this difference, and it has been pressed by evolution to be there, we will find a genetic difference between men and women on the signals for agreeableness and neuroticism. To date, we haven't found it. I just got back from the Association of Research Personality Conference, saw the definitive data that's going to come out from Ted Schwab on the genetics of the Big Five. And one of the big conundrums about the Big Five is that we can't find a genetic signal when we do the right kind of genetics research, which is on the GWAS side of things. There you're getting a really small signal when it comes to how genes are going to be affecting or contributing to individual differences in personality traits in particular. The twin studies are not valid in this case because there's too much that's going on there that contributes to a much bigger signal. So the definitive statements coming from the GWAS folks, you're getting a signal under 10% and lower when it comes to what's going on with the Big Five. And I know of no one who's shown that genetic signal is bigger or smaller for men or women. There, you've got the data sitting out in repositories. It could be analyzed tomorrow if you have the expertise. I can put you together with the people who have the expertise. The evolutionary folks know who they are. They could test this. And it would be I'd like to know the answer personally. So if it is the case that there is this evolutionary story that fits, you will see a gender difference in the genetic contribution to agreeableness and neuroticism in the GWAS studies that we're doing. And it should be pretty big. It should be detectable. And I don't know if it's true. I honestly do not. And then we have the counter finding, which is a real conundrum for us, which is that it doesn't seem to be that there's a strong additive signal from genes. There's lots of different things going on. I'm not saying that personality isn't genetic, but there's, for example, a lot of dominance heritability, the odd, quirky combination of your genes you get from your mom and your dad contribute to who you are in a way doesn't breed true, so it doesn't have any evolutionary significance. So that's the first thing I'd want to know if they could answer that question. The data's out there. I'd be curious to know what they find. The second one is, if it is the case that these differences matter for the survival and benefit of our offspring, then you would assume that parents' personality and parenting style would have a discernible effect on kids' well-being, correct?
Yeah.
You don't see it. It doesn't. If you actually look at the data and you ask the question, to what extent does the parent's personality and or parent style matter to the kid's personality? It doesn't. The signal's really small. I mean, and my genetics friends and who study other species are like, welcome to my world. So it's not, small in this case might not be that relevant, but I want to know why the relationship between parenting individual differences and the kids' outcomes. And by this, I mean the long-term ones that the evolutionary folks care about. Not whether, if you're a good parent by some standards in developmental science, your kid is happier when they're 3, but will they grow up to be a much more well-adjusted adult with a functioning personality that contributes to society in a positive way?
Yeah.
When you look at that as your outcome, there's so little relationship between what we do as parents and what happens with our kids that it's hard to make the argument that these differences that we see matter in the evolutionary sense. So I want those two questions answered. And if we get those answered, then I'll be okay with saying, yeah, sure, they're okay. So the data's there. They just need to, I think, ask that question.
That's a sobering fact. I think what you just mentioned about the role that parenting seems to play in the outcome of children. I've heard that in other conversations that I've talked to very smart people about.
It depends on what your kids are. If they're teenagers, it's a very liberating fact, because then you might not be as distressed about your lack of ability to influence them.
You're off the hook slightly.
Slightly. Not really. It's worse, right? You have all the responsibility and no authority. So it's like many situations in life.
Very true. In going over some of the subjects we've talked about today, I thought it might be helpful for you. And I know you mentioned this earlier, that this is something like a 14-week course that you give, I'm sure with an hour plus lecture every time, but for people,
and I drone on. So I sorry.
We all do. For people that have not ever heard a description or a short thumbnail description of what the OCEAN acronym differences really are, or what the big five personalities really are. I wonder if you might be able to just tick through in your mind kind of the rules of thumb there of what the differences with the big five are, and in any sort of short description that you think might be enlightening to people or just interesting to people in general.
So there's Presetto, a friend and colleague, has come up with a way of kind of making it simpler for us, which I like a lot. So instead of five things, you can think about three. So how do you behave with other people? It's a fundamental thing. Humans are more than a social species. We're hugely dependent on each other for our well-being and our functioning. How are you going to go about negotiating your interpersonal relationships? That's extroversion and agreeableness. Those are the first two of the big five. And they kind of really describe how you're going to go about relating to others. Are you going to lead? Or are you going to follow? As I said, are you going to do it in a friendly fashion? Or are you going to do it in an unfriendly fashion, right? That's the combination of extroversion and either agreeableness, that's the friendly leader, or disagreeableness, that's the dominant, forceful leader who's going to tell you what you should do and then ask questions later. That's in our world, a combination of high extroversion and low agreeableness. Are you going to be, the person who's going to step back and not participate and be cynical about what the persons are doing in charge? That's low extroversion, low agreeableness. And then there's, of course, the person who's going to be, probably the minion or the person who's going to follow along. That's high agreeableness, low extroversion. So, I'll do whatever you want to say and be agreeable about it. And those two of the big five really capture the way we go about relating to one another. And it's not that the others aren't important for certain aspects of relationships, but if you want to think about relationships, those are the first two. The other way to think about it is your emotional world. And that's kind of the combination of emotional stability and extroversion. Think of them as positive and negative affect in some respects. If you tend to have a bright radar screen for negative information, negative consequences of actions, maybe slightly higher fears, that's higher neuroticism. If you're one of those people who tends to be very positive about things, that's higher extroversion. You can have the combination, right? You can have somebody who is both. They're extroverted and neurotic. I like, these people are they're sharing their neuroticism all the time, and, you have these friends who are always talking to you about what's going on, and, that they're fun, but, they make life more interesting by any means. But they're both, right? And then, of course, you can have introverted and neurotic. And oftentimes we think of people who are really shy, painfully shy, as that combination. They're not out there with people and they have more fears. And so, and one of the fears they have are other people. That's a shy person. We tend to experience that, especially when we're young. We're much less secure, and we tend to overcome that with age. But that's the combination that you see in those two. And then, of course, you have the not neurotic, extroverted person. We love that, have them around in the social settings because they don't have any qualms about trying new things. They're doing stuff that would make other people blanch. They're dancing on the dance floor, and really out there. And then the third way to think about the big five is work style. That's the combination of conscientiousness and openness. Again, are you someone who likes to put the nose to the grindstone and get things done, in combination with whether you're curious, creative, and active, right? That combination doesn't happen as often as you might suspect. The typical academic, for example, tends to be low on a lot of aspects of conscientiousness and high on the curiosity and creativity side. I think I always argue to my colleagues that thank goodness for higher education. It's the last bastion for those of us who are not conscientious, because we can still have a career. Most jobs in the market tend to dictate that you be more conventional, more conforming, more hardworking in that sense. And so really demand that. Then it asks the question: are you going to be the person who's going to be, enacting what the leader says? That's going to be low openness. Or are you going to be the person who's going to be trying to come up with new ideas? And that's conscientiousness and openness together. So that I like his system because it tends to simplify it for us. And you just talk about interpersonal relationships, emotional style, and work style that captures the big five.
Brilliant. And I love the imagery of the radar screen for testing the trait neurosis. I think that's a good way to think about it. This is something that I thought about right before we connected on here is I've done a variety of different shows on this podcast about political tribalism recently. And obviously this is a total tangent from what we've talked about so far, but, I wanted to, again, get your thoughts on this in general about how, and you just talked about genes and the lack of influence that oftentimes parents end up having on the outcomes of their children, of that temperament, that personality temperaments that are kind of a stable part of your personality over your lifetime are hugely predictive of your political affiliations. And that I wanted to see if you could articulate the connection between these 5 traits or the 3 categories you just spoke about in giving a rough synopsis of, kind of the 2-party system that we're in the spirit of just trying to understand people who are politically different from you and how affected they might be by their natural personalities.
Yeah. So the relationships are pretty straightforward and robust. Openness is your best predictor of political affiliation, at least in the United States. I mean, we have a very simple system, 2-party system, conservative, liberal. Openness is the positive predictor of liberalism and negative predictor of conservatism. And that's the biggest effect. I wouldn't call it huge. It's there. And it's good to understand in the sense that people who tend to be more open to lots of things, lots of different ideas, will tend to be liberal in their orientation. There's lots of beefs against higher education for being a liberal institution. It's like, well, you selected us for being curious because we're all scientists and we want to know about the world. And so that's where that bias comes from, right? Because you have a selection system which rewards that aspect of personality because that's what our job is. And so, that when you see those intersections, like, oh, that institution is liberal, one reason is because we're being selected for those qualities. The other domain where you see a little bit of a relationship is conscientiousness, but not on the industriousness aspect, but more on what we think of as conventionality or traditionalism. So are you more of a rule-following person in your approach to the world? If you are, then you tend to be more conservative and less liberal. That effect size tends to be smaller. These are really robust when it comes to our system in the U.S. and a relatively undifferentiated view of politics. And you can get much more differentiated, which some people do, studying different aspects of contributing to the political body by voting or by campaigning or whatever you might do. There's lots of different political behaviors. When you start differentiating that way, you start getting different correlates. If you push the envelope into the more back after World War II, they talked about the authoritarian personality. So this is someone who wants, the strong leader who imposes rules and they're going to follow. That brings in low agreeableness and low openness. So that's the combination there. It's not as germane to most of the political conversations we have in the United States because we're really talking about, conservative and liberal, Republican and Democratic. And there, the personality correlates are a little less exotic, let's just say.
Yeah, I had heard that too about, you were mentioning that related to university communities, that I think Rob may have mentioned this when I saw him in New York, that's also true about cities, that large cities are a magnet for trait openness for people who disproportionately have that trait. And that's also kind of what you see in the data politically.
Well, and then there's, we haven't touched upon, to counter a little bit of the stereotype that can come across the personality, is this temperament that you're born with and you're stuck with. There's not a lot of evidence for that. Your personality at age 2 is really important. I hate to bring it to you. It's not predicting anything when you're an adult. Once you get to be an adult, the continuity is much higher. It's more robust, but there's still a lot of changes that happen. One of the biggest changes that occurs, at least in Western countries, is most people lose their openness. So you peak in openness in college when you're young, and so you see that same kind of effect with these demographic trends. Like, who goes to cities? Young people go to cities, right? It's the place, there's lots of energy, lots of things going on, lots of opportunities. It's a place where you establish yourself and try to do things to make your mark, so to speak. And then you move to the suburbs and then maybe to the rural areas where I live as you get older. And coincidentally, you're losing your openness as you're going along. And so you see this divide, which is driven in part by geographic location, but a lot by demography in terms of age differences. Older people are less open, more conscientious, more emotionally stable than younger people. And, this is going to feed into those political differences that you see, and the demographic differences. And so, we've created a culture in which this is true, and it has these selection effects, right? You're drawing the open, curious people to cities, and also the younger people, and then you're kicking them out as they get older because, they have kids and they get in a more stable situation and they want that stability, and so they wander out of the city. And it has this interesting kind of selection effect in terms of our communities.
Fascinating. I was reviewing an interview I did more than a year ago with a woman named Helen Fisher, who studies love of all subjects, who lives in New York. And we were talking in the interview I did with her quite a while back about the personality traits of the big five that are the highest predictor of one's inability to maintain long-term relationships. And and she spoke openly about the fact that it is an emotional instability or a high trait neuroticism. And we talked a little bit about why that might be and how someone who is experiencing that, right? My understanding is that is a trait. If you're high in trait neuroticism, that correlates with anxiety and depression as a state of mind. I have to imagine your students are very interested in this, and probably you are too. What advice you would have for people who do have and are on it, are self-aware about this, a very neurotic state of mind, and would prefer to reduce that as much as possible? I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak to that particular very unwelcome human experience that I think a lot of people go through, and what your thoughts are on mitigating that.
Yeah, I always ask my students at the beginning of the semester, how many of you want to get divorced? Have them raise their hand and say, well, 50% of you are going to get divorced. So let's think about it. Who's more likely to get that? And it's the low conscientious, high, neurotic folks who are going to experience that at a greater pace rate. And that's been shown a number of times. The answer is really simple, but it might not be satisfying. Go see a therapist. We did a meta-analysis in 2017 where we examined the relationship between going to a therapist and changing your big five. And seeing a therapist changes neuroticism a half a standard deviation, which is a lot. Now, by our standards, like we talked about this in terms of gender differences, it changes people more than the differences between men and women. And it was bigger for anxiety and anxiety-related traits, and for anxiety-related treatments, so to speak, the things that a therapist might do for that. And it was true for any therapeutic model that the therapist followed. Didn't matter whether they're CBT, whether behaviorist or psychoanalytic person, or relationships person. Seeing a therapist helps. And if you want to help yourself become less anxious, find a therapist, because they could help. I'm not saying that it's a guarantee. But at least in terms of effect sizes, it's pretty profound how much change you can see in that space. So that would be the first thing I'd recommend. And then wait. The other thing you can do is grow old, because as I said, we do change a lot as we get older, and we one of the most wonderful developmental stories is that we do become more emotionally stable with age. And again, a lot. We change a full standard deviation from when we're 20 to when we're 60 when it comes to emotional stability. Maybe even more. And, and you see that older people tend to be calmer. They tend to be less anxious. You look back when you're my age and you think, gosh, I wish I would have been like this when I was 20. Because, you know how scared you were at that point and how insecure, and that's neuroticism, and it affects your world in a lot of different ways that aren't really wonderful. And I used to joke before the pandemic that we didn't have any real good stories to why neuroticism might play a positive role in selection. But the pandemic provided one really good answer for why you might want to be neurotic. And I think there were some studies that bore out the fact that it was good for people. But waiting and getting the experiences you might have for adulthood accelerated a little bit, it might help you overcome some of that neuroticism that you experience, especially as a teenager and a young adult. So those would be the two things I'd recommend straight out. Getting a good job and a good marriage, are also potentially really important ways of overcoming our insecurities and our neuroticism. We know that if those of you who are lucky enough to be in satisfying jobs and satisfying relationships tend to accelerate your decrease in neuroticism faster than the rest of us. That's a great thing. And so, those are your recommendations. It's silly, I know, because please, not only find a career, but find one that's really satisfying. It sets a little bit of that expectation. But if you're fortunate enough to have that, and you can get into that space, it does have that type of effect. So those are the things that I would tell. That's what I tell my students. Wait, it's going to get better. And these are the routes that you might want to look to if you could find.
Fascinating. I know we're getting towards the end of the conversation and you've got to run in a few minutes here, but maybe to close on a couple final questions. If I heard you correctly, a half a standard deviation change on average in people who go and seek a therapist. What do you make of that? What is your best guess as to what's happening there to so successfully reduce neuroticism in people who do that?
It's a really good question because and that's what we've been trying to figure out subsequent to that study, for example, try to figure out what are the mechanisms involved, right? I mean, and we have some kind of relatively mundane findings like, what seeing a therapist does is it helps reduce stress. Stress is not the same thing as neuroticism. You have a lot of stress in your life for different reasons that can be changed. Your relationships, your work, things that happen in your life that you have no control over. Therapists can help you understand how to wrestle with those things, right? If you're thinking in a way that's maladaptive about basic life circumstances, the therapist can help you reconfigure the way you think about it. And it kind of inoculates you from experiencing that stress. You don't experience the stress, you don't feel the neuroticism. And so that seems to be one real clear answer. Sometimes, it gets you just back, a lot of the times when you see a therapist is when you're at your nadir, it's at your low point. And so they can recalibrate you and get you back to a point where you're functioning enough to be able to handle life. And just handling life is really, really key, right? Being able to go to work and be able to function in that space when something might be a problem is something that a therapist can really help you with. And so if you can manage those relationships, for example, that are challenging, or manage the difficulties that you're having in your work in a way that doesn't affect you as much, that can spiral in a positive way going forward. So I think that's what's happening with therapists, at least. I'm a skeptic, so I'm skeptical of my own findings. I don't think the effect size is really that large. I think it's probably smaller. I think there's some biases in that data. We've done our own studies and we've found similar effect sizes. I'm still uncomfortable with it. I think there's some biasing factors in the way these studies run. We tend to talk to the success stories, right? In intervention work, and this is true of all intervention work, the survivors are the ones that tell us their stories, right? And it's true in therapy. It's like the people who had a good time in therapy go, yeah, I'll fill out that survey again. And the people who didn't, they're not there at the end saying, well, it didn't turn out so well. So I'm a little skeptical that the effect sizes are that large. I want to be more skeptical about the lasting effects, but unlike the interventions we've done for cognitive functioning, all of the studies we've done so far to see whether the changes last have shown that they do. And it's disturbing the regularity that we're finding this. So we did some really nice work. Matthias Allemann was the person who led this work out of Switzerland, where we did personality big five changes using an app. And it was a really nice study because it was not clinical folks. And so one of the criticisms you have with the clinical work as well, there are people out there nadir, they're just going to bounce back. It's not very interesting. So we said, okay, let's try to change people on the big five just by changing people on the big five, and they're not clinical populations. So they're not suffering. They're not coming back from their low point. Can you do it? Turns out, yes, you can. And so 3-month intervention, practicing your conscientious behaviors every day, setting goals and achieving those things, reflecting on your activities, results in the same type of change there. And the change lasts. So they just did a year-long follow-up where they asked people to say, hey, where are you at now? And the folks who experienced change kept change in place. And that's unlike what you see for cognitive functioning, where there's a really well-known fade-out effect that they find. When you see short-term gains in cognitive functioning when you intervene on kids or on adults, and then after 6 months, it goes away. So, it's a new area. The whole question about whether you could change personality traits is something that only emerged in the last decade or so. And so we're all working through the data at this point to try to figure out what the story is. So beyond those recommendations, I'm still not totally confident we have a grip on what the story is. But it's provocative what we're finding. And it does provide some hope that if you don't like where you're at, there is potentially an answer that might be satisfying if you're willing to put the work. And I think the latter is really important, that it's not a simple thing. It's not an easy thing. It's not a fly-by-night thing. You're not going to transform yourself by doing a half an hour of daily affirmations, and that's it. Yeah. It's like running a marathon. You don't run a marathon unless you put the miles in. You want to change your personality, it's probably the same. You got to put the time in.
Fascinating. Brent, I love this conversation. I would love to chat again about all of this stuff. To me, it's one of the most interesting areas of academia. Thank you so much for your time. I know you got to run. If we could maybe close on just a brief point about the practical applications of your research and knowledge. Why does this information matter to culture, to people in general? I'd love to close on that.
Well, I mean, one of the trait domains we study is conscientiousness, for example, whether you're hardworking, organized, disciplined, rule following, and the like. What does that relate to? It relates to whether you have a higher GPA as an elementary school student, as a middle school student, and as a high school student, and as a college student. It relates to how much educational attainment you gather in your life. So how far do you go? You get a college degree. You go on and get a master's. It predicts your job performance once you leave school. So if you are more conscientious, people like you better as an employee. They're going to hire you, and they're going to keep you, and they're going to promote you, and they're going to pay you more. Not only that, it's going to contribute to let's say your relationship. We talked a little bit about this. So the big two when it comes to whether you keep your relationship intact are conscientiousness and neuroticism. If you're high on conscientiousness, you tend to stick with your spouse, and you have a stable, more satisfying relationship. You have a better social network. People are happier with you. We all like our friends who show up on time and are reliable. And the folks who can't be relied on, it always causes distress, right? That's low conscientiousness. So it helps in your relationships. It helps in your work. It helps in your health. So we have oodles of studies showing that you have better self-reported health and you have better objectively measured health. And so you're going to experience a better life course when it comes to the simple things that can really profoundly affect how you function, especially in older age. Are you going to have an easier, smoother time of aging? We all die and we all plummet at some point. The question isn't whether that happens, it's whether you're going to spend 15 years doing that or 2. And the conscientious people are experiencing not only longer lives, but healthier lives in the way they go. So here's just one trait domain, and it affects achievement, it affects love, and it affects physical health. And those are all fundamental things that we all care about as individuals, and society cares about too. Every society wants their citizens to have a smoother life in which they can have the achievements that they set out to achieve, and have a life in which they don't suffer needlessly from health insults or something like that. So if you care about those things, which pretty much everyone does, then you should care about conscientiousness, for example. And so, there's lots of practical reasons to care about these things and to try to understand them better. And I'm not saying that intervening on them is necessarily the answer. There's lots of things you can do to make it, you structure society so it doesn't matter as much, for example. But thinking about it and considering it and those really important questions for society and individuals is really, really, I think, it shows up in the data and it begs you to ask those questions. So there's lots of pragmatic and practical reasons for why one would be interested in their personality. It's not the reason I got into the field. I got into the field like you because I thought it was fascinating. Why are we all different from one another? Why are you the way you are? And I think it's fine to stop there. It's a great way to try to understand other people and understand yourself. And if you stop there, that's fine. But there's lots of practical reasons for it too.
Absolutely. Brilliant. I absolutely love this, Brent. Thank you so much for your time. I love your work, and I hope we get to talk again. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks, Dan. Have a good evening, and thanks for the conversation. Appreciate it. Love to come back if you want to talk further.
Would love to. Thanks, man.